Hello and welcome back to Coach Bill's Sports Show. I'm Coach Bill. If you're first time joining us, we do college football, fantasy football, pro football, play a little NCAA sometimes, working on trying to figure out how to do some play breakdowns for the community here. So if it's football related, we try to get it done. So thank you for joining us. Let's huddle up and let's get into it. So I went through this year's college football season and picked out the 3 must-watch games each week. So these are the games I'm watching. There is an honorable mention on most weeks, but these are the games I'm watching each week. Just for, is it a good game? Does it have national ties to it, or is it a make or break game for a season for one of the teams or both of the teams? So let's get into it. Week 1, Ohio State versus Notre Dame. Both of them are top 5 right now. If you saw my rankings video, you know who I think is going to win this one. I think Ohio State destroys Notre Dame. But it does have national title implications in Week 1, which is big. The number 2 game for Week 1 is Georgia versus Oregon. Another ranked team versus ranked team, Week 1. Georgia coming off a national championship. It's a neutral site game in Atlanta, so not really neutral. Clearly, it's going to be a Georgia-leaning fan base. And then Arkansas and Cincinnati is my 3rd game for the week. This is a big game for Cincinnati. Cincinnati really doesn't have a lot on their schedule this season as far as potentially ranked teams or potentially bigger name teams. And Arkansas is a big name team. SEC West team, definitely a team that's going to do well this season. So it would definitely help Cincinnati in this game. And for Arkansas, you got to win this game to keep your hopes alive. And it's Week 1, so there's a lot of pressure. Honorable mention for me this week is Utah versus Florida. I personally have Utah as a college playoff team and Florida with a new coaching staff. So it's going to be a very interesting game to watch. Week 2, there's some really solid matchups in Week 2. It was a little harder to pick some from Week 2, but Game 1, Alabama versus Texas, Nick Saban versus Steve Sarkisian. It's going to be a very good game. Alabama's defense versus Texas and the number 1 rated quarterback. Very good game. Personally, number 2 game is the game I'm looking forward to the most. Has less national title, but it hits home for me, and it's Pitt versus Tennessee. Pitt beat Tennessee last year in Tennessee. Tennessee's going to Pitt. I think they return the favor. Tennessee wins this game, but it's going to be a very, very good game to watch. Number 3 might surprise some people, but BYU versus Baylor. I think this is where BYU starts getting on the national radar a little bit more. And then if Baylor wins this, it definitely helps Baylor's chances for later on being a conference championship matchup with them in Oklahoma later on in the season. And then my honorable mention for this one, it's Kentucky versus Florida. Florida has been honorable mention first 2 weeks. They've got some big games to start the season, and Kentucky's got some big games to start the season as well. So it'll be a very interesting week to watch those games. Week 3, number 1 for me is Miami versus Texas A&M. Miami, I think Van Dyke is a little low on people's radars right now, and he could do some things at Texas A&M to kind of pop up nationally on the radar more. And then for Texas A&M, they got to beat everybody if they want to be in the national championship, and that includes Miami. So, and then my number 2 game this week for week 3 is BYU versus Oregon. Again, I think BYU is one of those sneaky teams this season. Back-to-back bigger games for them, for Baylor and Oregon. But if they can pull off both wins, it definitely is going to propel them in the rankings. Number 3 for me is Oklahoma versus Nebraska. This is, in my opinion, this is the first real test for Oklahoma under Brett Venables in week 3. And I'll be very interested to see how he does shaping his team, setting up his team for success in that game. My honorable mention is Georgia versus South Carolina. Georgia returning national championship, national champs. South Carolina with the transfer in of Rattler. It's going to be the first real test for South Carolina. Be very interesting to watch that game and see how it goes. See how the East is going to shape up this year in the SEC. Week 4. I would like to stop and thank whoever planned ahead and loaded week 4 like they did. There were a lot of good games this week. So it was a little harder to narrow down some teams, but Florida versus Tennessee is my number 1. Honestly, I'm a Tennessee fan, so it's big for me. But I think this could start the rivalry up again between Florida and Tennessee. It's kind of been dead. Well, let's be honest. It's kind of been dead. Florida's been pretty well owning Tennessee recently. And I think this would be not only huge for Coach Heupel and Tennessee, but also for the rivalry to kind of rebound. Week 4, number 2 for me is Wisconsin versus Ohio State. It's the first real test for Wisconsin, and it's Ohio State, so it has national championship implications, not only conference. Excuse me. Not only conference-based, but national championship as well. Number 3, Texas A&M and Arkansas. SEC West powers this year going at each other. Both of them have bigger games later on in the season, but they got to get through this one, and it's a pinch point for both of them. If they're both undefeated coming into this game, it really sets up for who's going to be the one to push Alabama for the SEC West. And it's only week 4. Honorable mention, Kansas State versus Oklahoma. Kansas State's one of those that I've heard sneaky things about this season, and it'll be interesting to see against Oklahoma. Can they be who people think they can be? I'm personally not as high on Kansas State, but since there's a lot of people betting them, it'll be a very interesting game to watch. Week 5. Week 5 is a little of a top-heavy week, but it's not a slouch week either. So we got NC State versus Clemson. I think that's a Thursday night game. So starting the weekend off right with a solid Thursday night game. NC State versus Clemson is really going to help decide the ACC this year. And then turn around and you've got Alabama versus Arkansas. Back-to-back tough games for Arkansas, facing Texas A&M and then Alabama. But it has huge implications for the SEC West as well. And then Baylor versus Oklahoma State. It's going to be a wonderful game to watch. Offensive game. Very explosive offenses. So, really good game to watch. And then an honorable mention for me is Kentucky and Ole Miss. Ole Miss doesn't have to worry about the golf balls and the mustard bottles like they did from Tennessee. But Kentucky is a strong team. And if Ole Miss hasn't got their stuff figured out, Kentucky can beat them. And not just beat them, but beat them soundly. So, anyways, week 6 comes around. And week 6 is... Week 6 is a little more away from the SEC than the rest of the weeks have been so far, but there is still a key point SEC matchup. Texas A&M versus Alabama. Everybody's going to be watching that one, especially with all the antics and stuff that happened in this offseason between Jimbo Fisher and God bless it, Saban. Sorry, forgot his name for a second. Nick Saban. So outside of that game, you also have Ohio State versus Michigan State. Big Ten matchup. Really, really good game there. You got Notre Dame versus BYU. BYU's a sneaky team. Notre Dame's a little overrated. I think that one's going to be really well. You got Utah versus UCLA. It's a really good week for football. Really good week for football. Week 6. Week 7, Alabama comes off back-to-back really tough games. And this is the third in that series, and that's Tennessee. Tennessee's an offense that is scary. Do they have the depth to beat Alabama, and can Alabama withstand this many tough games in a row, whether it's Arkansas, Texas A&M, and Tennessee? So it has some national championship implications. Has some rivalry implications because it is Tennessee versus Alabama. There's a lot of stuff mixed into that one. Then you also have Penn State versus Michigan, another big game for the Big Ten. You have Utah versus USC, which honestly, in my opinion, I think that decides the Pac-12 this year, and it's week 7. It's either going to be Utah or USC that represents the Pac-12 as the champion, and they play each other week 7. So that's huge game. And then you have Wisconsin, Michigan State, a little bit of an more of an old school mentality game, but it's going to be a lot of running the ball, a lot of hits on defense. It's going to be a really, really fun game to watch, especially if you got a little bit more of an old school mentality with you when it comes to football and what you enjoy watching. Week 8. Week 8, after the hype of week 5, 6, and 7, is a little bit of a letdown, but it's still got some really solid games in it. Ohio State versus Iowa. Iowa is one of those teams that you can never count out. Ohio State's a dominant team, don't get me wrong, but Iowa's one of those sneaky teams that can catch up to you. Same with the next game, Clemson versus Syracuse. Syracuse always gives Clemson problems. Always. It's year after year. Syracuse just has that thorn in the side for Clemson. And then you got Ole Miss LSU. You got Kelly at LSU. You got the transfer quarterbacks for Ole Miss and LSU. It's just there's a lot into that game, especially for the SEC West, for recruiting. There's a lot wrapped into that game. And then an honorable mention for me is Texas versus Oklahoma State. I think it's going to be a little bit more of a shootout, an explosive game, which is always really fun to watch. So, entertaining football. Week 9. Week 9, Virginia Tech plays NC State, two big ACC schools going at it. Depending on how NC State's played to this point, if they beat Clemson, if they've won all their games to this point, VTech could play spoiler for them and cause some problems. You have You also have that week the largest tailgate, which is Florida versus Georgia. Just a big old party. Wonderful SEC East game. You have Baylor versus Oklahoma that week, which, depending on how everything breaks down, how the season's gone throughout, this has the ability to be the Big 12 kind of, I don't want to say decider, but separator. It will show you who is really in charge of the Big 12 right now. Is it Oklahoma or is it Baylor? And then my honorable mention for that week is a little game off to the side. It's a Sun Belt game between Appalachian State and Coastal Carolina. To say these two teams don't like each other is an understatement. It's a wonderful game to watch. I don't know if you've ever gotten to watch an App State game or a Coastal Carolina game, but if you can find it, it's a hell of a game to watch. It's going to be a bunch of kids running around trying to take someone's head off because they absolutely hate each other. And it's great football. Great football. So week 11. Personally, for me, this will be the week this fall that I try to schedule stuff on because there's not a lot of great games. It was very hard to find the games where I was like, yeah, I've got to stop what I'm doing to watch that. So the 3 games this week are South Carolina versus Florida. It's an SEC game, SEC East game. Radler versus the Florida defense. It's the best SEC East game that week. Same for the next one. Alabama versus Ole Miss. It's the best SEC West game that week. But there's not really, there's a lot of teams that have homecoming games this week. And so you've got a lot of teams playing lesser named teams this week. I think, let's see here. If I'm not mistaken, you've got some really week 11, yeah. So you got like Notre Dame versus Navy. You have Ohio State versus Indiana. Like, there's not a lot of. You got Miami versus Georgia Tech. Just not a lot of games where it's exciting. It's not a lot. It's just not a good week for football, unfortunately. Week 11 is just not a great week for football. There's some wonderful stuff going on, but it's just not a good week for football. Week 12, though. Week 12 comes back and thankfully changes that. Clemson versus Miami. Big ACC matchup, especially if Clemson can do what they're supposed to be doing and win through the season, and Miami maybe takes a hiccup against Texas A&M but wins the rest of their games. It sets up a really, really good matchup there in Week 12. Then you've got Georgia-Kentucky, which, depending on how Georgia's played, how Kentucky's played, could be SEC East implications. You've got Oklahoma versus Oklahoma State, big in-state rivalry. Venable's first time in this rivalry, and it's an away game at Oklahoma State. Big matchup. And then you got Utah versus Oregon, another big matchup for a conference. It's a really, really strong week, thankfully, after week 11. Week 13 rolls around, and that's rivalry week. And I promise you my phone will be off for this Saturday. My phone will be off, and there will not be getting in touch with me because there is Notre Dame, USC, Alabama, Auburn, LSU, Texas A&M, Pitt, Miami, Georgia Tech, Kentucky, Louisville, Michigan, Ohio State, UNC, NC State, Florida State, Baylor, Texas, Clemson, South Carolina. It's just one right after the other. This is the week that you want to have multiple TVs, or at least the ability to flip through channels real quickly, because there's just solid games in every slot. I think that's how they wanted to set it up, and I love it. Absolutely love it. Hope there's more of it throughout the season in the future, but rivalry week is the one week in the season where I'll just shut everything else down. And that Saturday, boom, I'm in front of the TV and we're watching football. Thank you for joining me. If you like some of the games, let me know down below. If you think I missed some games, tell me. Let me know. Either way, thank you. Please like, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Definitely helps us here, helps the channel, helps everything grow, helps the community grow. Thank you once again for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Ready, break.